The sky was wide and indifferent over the Arizona border, where the land had forgotten how to welcome. Late afternoon light stretched long and unforgiving across cracked clay and shuttered windows, exposing more than it warmed. In that forgotten outpost, half wood, half dust, life didn't arrive. It lingered. The buildings leaned like men too tired to stand straight, their bones splintering into the ground. A nailed door hung crooked beneath a rusted bell that never rang. Wind passed through slats in silence, carrying the scent of old sweat, horsehair, and something burnt that once might have been bread. She stood in the middle of it all, barefoot, legs thin and steady as fence posts, her baby sister wrapped tight in a potato sack against her chest. The cloth was frayed at the seams, damp from the child's breath, stained in places no one noticed because no one looked too closely. But she stood, still, as if her body had learned long ago not to flinch. As if her stillness might convince the world she was invisible or unsellable or gone. She didn't cry. That was gone too. She'd buried it somewhere between the last goodbye and the first slap. Her lips stayed shut, her eyes fixed forward, but not at anything present. It was the kind of stare that had already rehearsed the worst, sold 1,000 times in her mind, and still counting. Men hovered in the heat, old miners with rusted coins in their pockets, a merchant with ink on his cuffs, a preacher too clean for the dust around him. None of them smiled. No one does in that kind of crowd. The auctioneer chewed tobacco as if he were bored, not cruel. His voice cracked like a dry branch each time he called the next item, the next body, the next price. He didn't look at the girl when he nodded in her direction. She wasn't a girl. She was weight and burden and maybe, a pair of hands that wouldn't cost much to feed. And somewhere behind the cluster of men, quiet as dusk, a cowboy watched, hat pulled low, hands loose at his sides, not resting, not reaching, just still. He looked like someone who'd forgotten how to speak to people and never missed it. No one knew him. Maybe he came for salt, maybe for nails, maybe for something not even he could name. But he watched. The baby's breath rose and fell against the girl's chest, too light to count, too soft to interrupt. The older sister blinked once, not from fear, but from memory. Her mother had once whispered to her, before the sickness took her voice, "Don't blink when they try to take your worth. Don't let them see you lower your eyes." So she didn't. She kept her spine straight, even as the weight of her sister pulled her forward, even as the crowd shifted and murmured, even as the auctioneer spat and stepped closer. No music played, just the clatter of boot heels, the rustle of dust against old canvas, and the whistle of wind weaving through broken boards. But in that silence, something sacred stirred, barely audible, barely real. It was the kind of silence that held its breath before something shifted, before something broke or healed. And the cowboy didn't speak, but he stayed. And that alone was already more than most had ever done. No one spoke. That was the rule. In towns like that, silence was more than habit. It was a kind of law. You didn't ask questions unless you were willing to pay for the answer. You didn't interrupt unless you were willing to bleed. And you sure as hell didn't step forward unless you were prepared to lose something or someone. But he did. Not with noise, not with announcement, just one step, slow, weighted, like the ground needed time to understand it had just been defied. He didn't raise a hand, didn't nod, didn't shout a bid. He just moved forward, one step, and the dust noticed before the men did. Eyes turned, breaths caught, not out of fear, not exactly, but out of the strange sensation that something was about to shift, that maybe this moment, this one, might matter later, might echo. The cowboy stood at the edge of the platform where the girl balanced her sister against her ribs. He didn't look at the auctioneer, didn't look at the men. His eyes, when they rose beneath the shadow of his hat, settled only on her, not scanning, not assessing, just seeing. A whisper came from the side, one voice, uncertain, curious, half-mocking. "Is she yours?" It wasn't a question meant to be answered. It was a statement cloaked in doubt, tossed like a stone into a still pond. But he didn't answer, just tilted his hat forward, barely. Not a nod, not quite, but enough to quiet the air. He reached slowly to the post where the rope was tied, the same rope that had held mules, calves, and now a child who refused to flinch. The knot had been pulled tight once. Now it came undone with quiet fingers and no ceremony. The girl didn't move, but her body leaned, just barely, toward the direction of his hands, not away. He didn't take her hand. He didn't lift her sister. He simply looped the frayed end of the rope and tied it to his own saddle. A gesture without ownership, without possession, just a new tether, a choice. No one laughed. No one jeered. Something about the moment silenced even those who had come to be entertained, because they saw it too. The man wasn't buying, he wasn't saving, he was standing. And that, in a town where silence ruled, was louder than any sermon. He turned then, not to speak, not to explain, but to lead, and the girl followed, not because she trusted him, not because she understood, but because, for the first time in a long time, the rope around her wrist didn't burn. It simply rested there, soft with dust and waiting. The trail out of the outpost was rough, carved more by hooves than by hands. Dust rose like ghosts behind the cowboy's horse, and the girl walked beside it, not on it. She held her sister close, still wrapped in the potato sack, though the sun had begun to cool. Her feet were cracked, her dress clung like old bark, and yet she kept pace. Not one word had passed between them, not one glance shared more than what the wind already carried. At camp he built a fire from dead mesquite. It crackled low like something cautious. He placed a tin plate by the flames and laid 2 pieces of bread near it. Then he stepped back, 10 paces, maybe more, sat on a flat stone and drank from a dented flask. His silence wasn't cold. It was deliberate, like he knew that some wounds only breathe when left alone. She didn't touch the bread right away. Hunger had rules. You waited to see the cost. You waited to learn the trick. But when the baby stirred, she broke the crust between her fingers, softened it with her own spit and fed the smallest mouth first. The baby fell asleep with a sound that wasn't quite a sigh, wasn't quite a dream, just a soft rhythm, safe for now. The girl didn't sleep, not truly. She crouched near the fire, the knife in her lap carved from bone. The handle was smooth with oil and time. It wasn't sharp, not enough to wound, just enough to be seen, just enough to say, I still have a choice. She watched the man, not to study, not to plan, just to understand. Why hadn't he spoken? Why no questions, no commands? Her mind searched for the trap, the turn, the price, but all she saw was a man who moved slowly, who didn't fill the silence with stories, who didn't stare, who didn't flinch. When the fire sank into embers and the coyotes sang from the ridgeline, she finally laid the baby down beside her and lay back against a rock. Her eyes stayed open longer than they should have, but her muscles one by one stopped bracing. And the baby? She slept deeper than she had in weeks, her small fist unclenched, her breath steady. That night, nothing healed, nothing was fixed, but something loosened, something uncurled, and that was enough. He had baptized her once. She remembered the cold water, the smell of oil and old cotton, the way he'd pressed his hand against her forehead and whispered her name like it mattered, like it meant something more than survival. She was 5. Her mother had wept, not from joy, from exhaustion, from a hope so fragile it cracked even in prayer. Now he stood on the porch of the town's chapel, the same man, the same cloth, only stiffer, whiter, his hands folded over a Bible bound in leather, the corners curled from sun and sweat. He didn't look at her when the auctioneer spoke her name, didn't blink when the rope was tied, didn't flinch when the crowd appraised her like cattle, though he had once called her child of grace. The betrayal wasn't in what he did, it was in what he allowed. He didn't bless the auction, but he didn't condemn it either. He stood still, nodding politely when coins changed hands. He offered a brief benediction under his breath, not for her, but for the buyers. The kind of prayer that floats above real pain, detached, decorative, hollow. She kept a piece of cloth from the church. It was once part of a curtain, or maybe an altar covering, soft white marked with wax from too many candles burned in vain. Her mother had sewn it into a dress lining once, thinking it holy, thinking it would protect. Now it lined the baby's wrap, a quiet, threadbare reminder of what faith had failed to do. At night, when thunder rolled in far from the horizon, she heard his voice, not in words, but in rhythm, the way he used to hum hymns during evening service, the way his voice caught on the word redeem. She heard that same cadence in every storm now, a liturgy of loss. The cowboy didn't ask about the preacher, he didn't mention the church, but when they passed it again, days later, he slowed the horse, not to stare, not to remember. Just enough to let her decide whether to look. She didn't. Some places don't deserve your eyes twice. He gave her that choice, and in doing so, gave back something small, something sacred, something the preacher never had. Some men pry open stories like locked chests, eager to claim whatever's inside. Others wait, pretending patience, while their eyes ask too many questions. But he was neither. He didn't chase words. He didn't even look for them. And maybe that's what made them come. Nights were cold that week. The fire burned low and slow, casting long shadows across the earth. The baby had stopped crying in her sleep, a kind of quiet surrender. The girl, still no name given, still no trust offered, sat near the flames with her arms wrapped around her knees, gaze caught somewhere between memory and the horizon. That night she didn't speak, but her hands moved. In the dust near the fire she traced a tree, bare, branches reaching like fingers searching for what had left. No leaves, no roots, just the idea of something that once stood taller than its wounds. He didn't ask what it meant, didn't compliment her drawing. He didn't say anything at all, just watched, then reached for another log and placed it gently onto the fire. The crackle that followed was soft, respectful, like a nod between two souls who've seen things they won't describe. She kept drawing, not trees now, just lines, marks, shapes that only made sense if you knew the places she'd been. The fields walked at night to escape hands, the barn, where she'd hidden 3 days with a fevered baby and a piece of bread, the creek that still ran through her dreams, where her mother had once said, "If we make it past winter, maybe we get to be people again." Still, he asked nothing. That's how she knew he was listening. People think that storytelling begins with speech. It doesn't. It begins with space, with presence, with someone staying beside you long enough that the silence turns soft, that the air becomes safe, that your own voice doesn't sound like betrayal when it returns. By the third night, she told him her name, only once, barely louder than the wind. He didn't repeat it. He just tipped his hat slightly and poured her a second cup of coffee from the tin kettle. Bitter, warm, enough. She didn't explain the tree, or the scars, or why the baby's eyes sometimes went wide with terror for no reason at all, but her voice came back slowly, sentence by sentence, breath by breath, not because he asked, but because he didn't. They had just crossed a dry riverbed when the dust rose again, not from wind but from hooves, fast, deliberate, a sound that didn't belong to distance, but to decision. When the deputy arrived, he wore more metal than mercy, badge shining, boots polished, paperwork folded crisp inside a leather pouch like scripture, a pistol low on his hip, but his hand already close. The cowboy didn't move, just let the horse slow, let the girl step slightly behind him without being told. He didn't draw, didn't posture. His silence, as always, was sharper than any blade. The deputy's voice was smooth, rehearsed. "There's been word," he said, eyes on the girl, "that the child was taken from kin. There's an aunt down in Benson. She's filed claim." But the girl's face did not flinch. Not this time. She'd heard that tone before. That kind of justice that wraps its hands around your wrist and says it's protection. That kind of authority that learns your name just to erase it. The cowboy took one step forward. Just one. No threat. No rush. He stood between them now. Between badge and child. Between paper and memory. His body quiet but unmoving. And his silence said more than any plea ever could. The deputy tried again. "You got no papers? No right? No blood tie?" Still, nothing. No raised voice. No defense. Just the cowboy's hand resting lightly on the saddle where the rope still hung. The same rope he had untied from a post. The same knot that had never pulled tight again. The deputy studied him, searching for something to provoke, to push. But there was nothing to push against. The man was stone. Not cruel, not angry, just resolved. And in that kind of silence, men either back down or break. This one backed down. He muttered something about returning with orders, about consequences, about procedures. But no one listened. Not really. Because even the law, when it smells fear, retreats. When the dust settled and the horse's gallop faded into the hills, the girl finally exhaled. Her shoulders dropped just slightly. The baby whimpered, then went quiet again. And the cowboy? He didn't turn to look at her. He didn't ask if she was all right. He just checked the saddle, adjusted a loose strap and started walking again. Because some men protect with words, others with weapons. But the rarest kind, the ones you never forget, they protect with presence, with stillness, with the simple act of standing in front. Dawn came quiet that day. Not pink, not gold, just soft, like the sky was tired too. The fire had long gone cold, the last embers buried in a bed of ash, but he'd already saddled the horse, checked the pack, poured the last of the coffee into a tin he didn't sip from. The girl didn't speak. She was watching her sister sleep, breath warm against her chest, fingers curled near her collarbone. Something in her face had changed over the days, not softened but steadied. She wasn't waiting for the next betrayal now. She was preparing for what came after. That quiet, uncertain space where the fear lifts, but trust hasn't arrived. He turned to secure the last strap when she stepped forward, silent as dust. In her palm, a round brass compass, old, dull from years in a pocket that hadn't been sewn to last. It didn't point north anymore, not reliably. The glass was scratched, the needle lazy in its circle, but she held it out like it mattered. He paused, looked at her hand, not her face. She didn't explain, didn't justify, just held it steady, the way someone offers a name or a wound. Her father, she'd said once, only once, used to carry it, said it helped him find home after too many nights in places where men forget where they belong. He drank, he vanished. He returned smelling of wood smoke and regret, but always with that compass in his hand. And now she was giving it away. He didn't refuse. Didn't thank her. Just took it gently and placed it in the small side pouch of his saddlebag, where things stayed close but didn't clatter, like memory, like meaning. He never used it, not once, but he never lost it either. And when years later someone asked if he believed in signs, he didn't answer with words, just touched that pouch, lightly, like a man tracing the outline of something he still doesn't fully understand, but knows better than to forget. Because some gifts aren't for direction, they're for memory. And some memories, once trusted into your care, become your compass, even if the needle never settles. Years passed the way dust settles, slow, unnoticed, until one day you realize the shape beneath has changed. The outpost, once crooked and coughing, now stood hollow. Roofs caved in, signs faded into silence. Nature had begun to reclaim what man abandoned. Vines climbed the beams, weeds cracked the steps, and the wind moved through as if remembering something sacred it couldn't quite speak. On the porch of what had once been the storehouse, a pair of boots sat, too small for a man, too worn for a child, left there not in forgetfulness, but as punctuation, as if to say something happened here, something worth leaving a trace. No one remembered their names, not truly. There were stories, of course, half-spoken by traveling peddlers, murmured in border towns, about a girl who walked barefoot with her sister wrapped to her chest, about a man who didn't speak, but made men lower their eyes, about how he didn't bid, didn't buy, just stepped forward. Some said he was a ghost. Others said he'd once worn a soldier's coat, but took it off the day he saw more mercy in silence than in flags. The girl. They said she grew up near the river bend, raised goats, never married, but she sang to the wind when she thought no one was listening. Songs without words, like lullabies passed down in breath instead of language. The baby? No one knew. But someone once found a school in a far county with a teacher who wore a compass on her belt. Said it didn't point anywhere useful, but she kept it close. Said it reminded her that being lost wasn't the same as being alone. And on one quiet morning, years after the outpost emptied, a child stopped by. Not from there, just passing. He knelt in the dust outside the church steps and with his finger began to draw. A tree, not a big one, not perfect, but this one had leaves, small, scattered, reaching. And as he drew, the breeze picked up. Not wild, not loud, just enough to lift the edge of a forgotten curtain inside the chapel, wax-stained, sun-bleached. Still there. No one spoke. No one needed to. Because not all families are born. Some are built in the pause between pain and promise. And when that pause is honored, when it is truly seen, it plants roots. Even in soil once thought barren. Even in towns time tried to erase.